working. You're all fascinated by the things up on the screen. All right, there we go. All right, so open up your booklets, please. You're going to need a Bible. If you don't have one with you, grab one off the back table there for me. And let's take a look at lesson number 20. That's where we are. For those of you tuning in from home on the video, take a look at that. And I'll have an assignment for you guys watching from home at the end of the video. So take a look there for now. All right, so after long last, we have finally arrived at the place where the answer in crossover class is always what? Jesus, right? So we finally arrived at the end of the Old Testament. We've actually already talked about what we call the Inter-Testamental Period, and that just is the period between the Testaments, Old Testament, New Testament. Can somebody tell me? It was from the quiz. How many years between the Old Testament and the New Testament as far as when the books were written? So the end of Malachi to John the Baptist showing up. How many years? You guys remember? Somebody take a guess. 400, right on the money. Yep, 400 years roughly. And so that was that period of time. And so what we want to do is we want to just kind of take a look. What were the circumstances, the conditions of Jesus' arrival? And then we're going to look at some of the differences between the Gospels. How many Gospels are there? 4. There are 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each one of them is unique and yet similar. And some people have often asked, they said, well, why do there have to be 4 Gospels? Well, I don't have a great answer for you other than that's what God determined, right? But we know that there are 4 books in the Bible written specifically to reveal Jesus to people. And you guys have certainly seen something like a diamond, right? A real diamond, or at least know what it looks like, whether it's in somebody's ring or something like that. So you understand that there's this gem, and there's different flat spaces on the gem, and those flat spaces are called facets. And gems have multiple facets, okay? So when you look at a diamond, well, let me give you something, maybe not a diamond, but a prism. You guys know when you look at a prism, light goes through it, makes a rainbow on the other side, a light prism. So a prism is a crystal that has various sides to it, right? It's a 3-dimensional shape. And even though you're looking at the same crystal, you can look at different angles at it from the different facets. I really believe that's sort of what the Gospels are. Every Gospel is about Jesus. It just kind of looks at him from a slightly different angle, right? Whereas John talks about Jesus this way, Matthew talks about him this way. It doesn't change who Jesus is, and they're not talking about different people. But I imagine that if you had a couple of friends that knew you, they wouldn't necessarily describe you exactly the same. One friend may say, oh, that person loves this kind of game. And the other person's unaware of that. So they wouldn't include that in their description of you. One might say this is where this person lives, and the other person is not sure where you live, right? So just different facts and different experiences kind of come into that. All right, so we're going to talk about Jesus' birth and his childhood. Can you guys, without looking ahead, can you guys tell me what stories do we have about Jesus before he's an adult? What kind of stories do we have about Jesus, Landry? Yeah, when mom and dad left him in Jerusalem, right? They left without him. It's kind of a funny story, I guess, in a way, because you left the Son of God back in Jerusalem. But yeah, he's 12 years old, got left back in Jerusalem in the temple, and when they find him 3 days later, he's there talking with the priests and the teachers of the law, asking questions and things like that. Any other examples?
A couple days after he was born, he was taken to be blessed.
Yeah, kind of what we do with babies to be baptized. He was taken to the temple to be dedicated, right? And so, yeah, just a young infant at that point, and then of course his birth, right, in Bethlehem on Christmas night, as we see it. So those are the only times that we see it, but nonetheless, there's still a lot to discuss with this. So would somebody read those first 2 paragraphs in the brown box there, the big picture? Shiloh?
When the fullness of time come, God sent forth his Son. Galatians 4, verse 4. God's people have been waiting a long time for the promised Messiah. Thousands of years, in fact. Finally, the time is right. God sends his only Son into the world to be born of a woman, to be born as one of us. Jesus Christ, the promised offspring of King David, is born and raised not in a palace, but in the humble towns of Bethlehem and Nazareth. Jewish shepherds and Gentile wise men from the east come to worship the baby king. Faithful old believers, Simeon and Anna, thrilled to see the infant face of the long-awaited Savior. The boy Jesus grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Luke 2, verse 4.
Good, stop there. So right away we know that when the time was right, I've had people ask, why did Jesus come when he did? Right? 2,000 years ago, because the earth is not just 2,000 years old. There's a lot of Old Testament history there. So why did Jesus come when he did? Right? Why didn't he wait and come now? Right? In the year 2020. I did. The time was right. So we're going to look at why we think that time was right on the next pages. All right. That next paragraph there, the four Gospels. Somebody read that for us? Go ahead, Connor.
The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all tell the life of Jesus Christ. Jesus' birthday and childhood is recorded only in the books of Matthew and Luke. The author of Matthew is the Apostle Matthew Levi, former tax collector turned disciple. The author of Mark is John Mark, cousin of
Barnabas.
Luke was a physician who was a contemporary of Paul. Luke, who also wrote Acts. John was written by the Apostle John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. The account in his lesson occurred 2 BC through AD 14.
Okay, so around the span of Jesus' life and his birth. So it gives you some details about the four Gospels, right? So we know that Matthew, also known as Levi, was a tax collector. Now, when you're a tax collector, who do you work for in Jesus' time? Ada? The Roman government. Do you think as a Jew who was captured, in a sense, and oppressed by the Romans, that Matthew was a popular guy? No, not at all, right? In fact, it would be like kind of working for, maybe not the enemy, but pretty close, right? It would be, if a country came in and conquered the U.S., I don't think that's going to happen, but if they did, and then you go to work for that country, your countrymen, your common citizens and people around you probably wouldn't care much for you whatsoever. Mark is John Mark, cousin of Barnabas. Barnabas goes on some missionary trips with Paul. Luke was a physician. In fact, when you look through, and we're not going to spend a lot of time in each of the Gospels tonight, but you find that Luke diagnoses some of the things that Jesus does with a little bit more detail. Whereas Matthew finds a man in a temple. He doesn't find him, but they're there with Jesus. And the man has a shriveled hand, right? It's much smaller than the other hand. And so Matthew just says, the guy has a shriveled hand, and Jesus heals him. Luke tells the same story, and he says the man has palsy. And so what he recognizes, he diagnoses the shriveled hand as being this condition called palsy. Matthew doesn't know that. Matthew's a tax collector, right? He doesn't know what palsy looks like. He just knows that that old man's hand is smaller than the other one. And so that's all he knows, right? So each one kind of brings with it their own personality, their own gifts. That's one of the things I think I really enjoy as I work in church, is you get to see so many of the differences of God's people, how they're all made, wired, created differently, and not all just the same, right? And how wonderful that can be. All right, so flip the page, 82. Page 82. And let's talk about the Gospels and how they're unique, I think is the right answer. So under the Gospels, it says this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each tell the account of the earthly life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Underline this next sentence. Matthew, an eyewitness to much of what he recorded. Underline that for me. Matthew, an eyewitness to much of what he recorded. And then I'll go on. Emphasize that Jesus was the Son of God, true King of Israel, and who fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. So that's his focus. So if you were to look at all four Gospels together, that would probably be a fair assessment of what you'd come up with as far as, so what does Matthew pay attention to, right? He talks in a way as he was present for many of those things, right? Some of the disciples, they get it from other disciples that were there, okay? Mark's is a gospel of action. Underline that for me. Mark's is a gospel of action, right? He most likely drew from Peter's testimony, okay? Mark emphasized the deeds of Jesus and Jesus' powerful words to perform deeds. So you have a lot of miracles in the Gospel of Mark, and a lot of inside knowledge, which seems to lend himself to one of the inner three. Do you guys know who the inner three, as far as the disciples are? The ones that Jesus would sometimes take aside and teach?
Peter, James, and John.
Bingo. Peter, James, and John. So if Mark tells a story about what Peter, James, and John saw, it's not as an eyewitness, because Mark wouldn't have been in there. It would have been just Jesus, Peter, James, and John. So he would have got the story from one of those, Peter or James or John. And since John kind of wrote his own gospel, Mark likely got it from Peter, they think, because of his connection to him. Third one here, underline this, Luke carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Jot that down. Carefully investigated everything from the beginning. This is probably more of how he's wired. I am sure that Matthew was smart when it came to math. He was a tax collector, right? So you guys have students in your classes, I'm sure that you'd say, this person is a real good, they're real good at memorizing. This person's really good at math. This person's really good at public speaking. This one's really good at dates in history or whatever. We all have our own little strengths, right? Well, because Luke was probably a physician, that probably lends himself that he tends to be somewhat data-oriented. Now, even though in Jesus' time, doctors weren't doing surgery and things like that, but they still had to diagnose and treat and things like that. So his knowledge of the human body and things like that probably was at least more advanced than the rest of the disciples. What was probably the most common job of a disciple, of all 12 of them? What was the most common job? It wasn't a tax collector, and it wasn't a physician.
Well, it isn't really a job, but like...
Not being a disciple, but what other jobs did they have? A lot of them. Ada? Fishermen, right? You remember that Peter, Andrew, James, John, those guys were all fishermen. And because of that is, and I'm not saying this to be negative, that is what we'd consider a blue-collar job. Right? It didn't require a tremendous amount of knowledge of data. Your job was to catch fish. And so you knew fishing. In fact, Jesus knew that because when he called them, he says, I will make you fishers of men. And they're all thinking, fishing, I know. Catching men, not too sure what he means by that. What he was making is you're going to tell other people about me. Right? You're going to grow other disciples and so forth. All right. And then... Luke's gospel, let me just finish that out, was written for the church to be used for teaching. Luke told the account of Jesus from birth to death and resurrection. If you guys have ever read the Christmas story we're going to touch on a little bit tonight, Luke 2 is always the one we read from. Always. It's the one that has the most detail about the birth of Jesus. And because of that, again, you kind of get this idea when you read the Gospels, Luke, pretty smart guy. Pays attention to details, things that are said, places that they are, and so forth. Fourth one, underline this. John recorded details and many of Jesus' difficult sayings. Underline that. John recorded details, many of Jesus' difficult sayings. And also recorded that Jesus performed many signs, miracles, that demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah. John often referred to himself in the gospel in the third person. Right? So if I were to refer to myself in the third person, I would say something like this. Pastor is standing up front teaching you guys tonight. And you're like, aren't you the pastor? Right? Third person is you're describing yourself as if you are not them, but you are them. Right? If Ada says, Ada is enjoying pastor's class right now. if she said that, right? Which clearly is true, right, Ada? You're enjoying the class? You don't have to answer that. But it's the third person. John often called himself, he referred to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. In fact, he talks about in his gospel love more than any of the other disciples, right? Any of the other gospels. So he just really, so a lot of times as a pastor, when I'm talking to someone who's struggling with something in their life, and they just really need to understand who Jesus is and what he's all about, a lot of times I'll point them to John and say, read through John because you will hear about love in a way that is just awesome, right? Not love like Valentine's Day or things like that, but love that is from God and it's selfless and sacrificial. Last paragraph here. The reason and purpose of all four gospels is stated by John. So John 20, it says this. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, in John. But these, the things that are written in John, are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So the Gospel of John, or the Apostle John here, writes down near the very end of his book, it says that, listen, Jesus did lots of things that we didn't write down, right? You can imagine they didn't just follow Jesus around and said, Jesus walked up a hill. Jesus walked down a hill. Jesus turned right. Jesus walked into Galilee, said hi to an old woman. Old woman had a brown robe on. Jesus walked a little further, smiled at a cat. Then he walked, that would be pointless to write down every single detail of Jesus. But there are also things that Jesus did, probably miracles, that didn't get recorded in the Bible. And the reason being, guys, is because it wasn't necessary to outline every single miracle. So Jesus in the book of John, Jesus is actually recorded as feeding several thousand people on two different occasions. One of them we pay attention to, we talk about, but there was a second one as well, right? Now, if you read it and you believe that Jesus fed 5,000 people, which in reality was a lot more than that, because that was just the number of men there, and they were outside, so there were no restrictions, so there would have been women and men there, children as well. And so if he fed, so let's just be conservative here, 15,000 people with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, would you be impressed? Yeah. If he did it twice, would you be even more impressed? Maybe, right? But I mean, the first time, you're like, that's a miracle. It's a great miracle. If he did it again, you'd go, another great miracle. But it's still a miracle, right? If he did it 5 times, right, at some point in time, you're like going, I get it. Jesus can do this stuff, okay? So my point is that Jesus very readily could have done more than the miracles that are listed there. In fact, John's kind of saying so. And he said, we didn't write it all down because it would have been this huge volume of information, and it's unnecessary. The point of the Gospels is to point at Jesus, right? To be able to show that he is the Christ. Somebody tell me what that term means, Christ. You guys remember what Christ means? Ada? Those are the same words, Messiah and Christ. Messiah is Hebrew, Christ is Greek. They mean the same thing, but what do they mean? Do you remember? The anointed one, right? So Messiah is Hebrew for the anointed one. Christ is Greek for the anointed one. But it means that he's the chosen one. He's the Savior, exactly as you said. All right? So, what is the state of the world? I want to give some details. I'm going to show you a graphic on the screen tonight. Give us some help here. So, state of the world. Somebody read that paragraph? Go ahead, Shiloh.
The time was right for the coming of Christ. Alexander the Great had spread the Greek language throughout the Middle East. The Maccabees had rid the Judeans of pagan worship practices. The world was at rest under the stable rule of the Roman Empire. The kingdom of iron prophecy in Daniel 2 verse 1, and would stay at rest for centuries. The prevalence of the Greek language would aid the spread of the gospel, as would the wildcat Roman birds.
Okay, so we talked about how the time was exactly right. In fact, Shiloh, you said this. The time was right for Jesus to come. So now we could say, well, now is the time, it is right, and so forth. Okay, but this is probably the first time that it's absolutely, the conditions are right. Let me show you why. We've talked about Daniel. We talked about how Daniel was one of the prophets that was taken away into what land? Where did he get taken away? Babylon. By whom? The Babylonians. Who was the king? Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar takes him away. If you also remember, he came with 3 guys with him as well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and so forth. Now, while he's there, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, right? And this is what actually brings Daniel into the picture. He has this very disturbing dream that he says that I saw a statue, and it had a head of gold, and an upper body of silver, and a waist of bronze, and iron legs, and clay and stone for feet. And he said, I see these things, and then I want to show you what happens that he sees as a result of this. Sorry, I want to show you the second picture of what his dream is. Come on. Here we go. All right, so we see this example here. So I know you can't quite see the letters very well, but way up at the top in that yellow, right at the bottom of that, let me see if I can I even get my finger up there? No. I need a pointer, right? See Nebuchadnezzar up there, and Belshazzar, it's in parentheses, way up at the top in the yellow. So that's the Babylonian kingdom, right? So the Babylonians are, according to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and God gave him this dream, according to the dream, the Babylonians are the most powerful kingdom. That's why they're the head. Golden head, right? And so Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful, hauls off the Hebrews, Daniel's part of that, and so forth. While Daniel's there for several decades in Babylonia. And Babylon eventually gets overthrown by the Persians and the Medes. It's a second kingdom that comes in and kind of beats up on the Babylonians. Now you guys should recognize this name, Darius. King Darius. Does that ring a bell with the story? Daniel, when he got thrown into the lion's den, King Darius. Okay, so Daniel is involved with the Babylonians, and then later on with the Persians and the Medes. Okay, and so what we see is that each of these kingdoms is a little bit weaker, maybe not so strong as the one previous, or as grand. So here we have Alexander the Great. These are the Greeks, and it's mentioned there. This is one of the reasons that Jesus comes when he does, because the Greeks, Alexander the Great, conquers everything. And it also standardizes the language. Since they conquer everything, right? Everybody, at least, most people are familiar with the Greek language. Where before you kind of have Persian language, Hebrew language, Greek language all mixed up. And so it standardizes it. Then later on, the Greeks get overthrown by the Romans. And then we have all the different Caesars, Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar, things like that. Legs of iron, right? They're warlike, they're strong, and so forth. So right here is where Jesus enters into the picture, right? So here you see, you can't quite read it, 150 BC to 395 AD. So he was at 0. That's when Jesus showed up. And then down here is a whole bunch of different kingdoms. That's why it's all kind of rock and stone. It's not really sturdy because it kept changing. So right here, this is the reason that the timing was right for Jesus to come, right? The Greeks make it all one language. The Romans build roads. And roads make it easier to transport from one place to the other, to walk and to travel. It's safer to travel because there's laws and things like that. Now, I'll show you another picture here. This was the end result of his dream, is that a stone from heaven comes down and destroys the statue. This is what upset Nebuchadnezzar, and he wanted to know what it meant. So Daniel comes in, interprets the dream. He says, this is the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God will eventually rule over all eternity, heaven, and things like that. And recognizing that God is more powerful than all the kingdoms. And so that's why he really kind of comes to this awareness through this, that God is supreme. So, okay. All right. Let me clear that. So we have the right time and the right timing for Jesus to come and enter into the world. So open up a Bible, if you would, to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. Everybody, please. John chapter 1. John 1:1. And we'll talk about this one. John 1, or the Gospel of John, rather, is unique than all the other three Gospels. The other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are what we call synoptic, right? Fancy words, synoptic. But what it means is similar, or they're synchronized. Do you guys know what synchronized means? You ever heard the word?
They all kind of go together.
Yeah. If you've ever, there's synchronized swimming. Sometimes watches, when you go, let's synchronize our watches and make sure they're the same time and so forth. It means that things line up. Matthew, Mark, and Luke really talk about the life of Jesus very similarly. They're synchronized. But John's gospel begins differently, where the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke either start with the birth of Jesus, makes sense, or the one who announces Jesus, which is who? Who announces Jesus? John the Baptist. So it's either about John or it's about Jesus, or, and we're going to see, or the genealogy of Jesus, which really kind of talks about his ancestry. But John begins differently. Would somebody read 1 through 4 of John 1? Shiloh?
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men.
Yeah, stop there. So this seems somewhat cryptic, which means it's kind of mysterious as far as what are we talking about here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All right? Do you think that that word in there refers to the Bible? Look how it's used. Can you replace the word Bible in there? Does it make sense? In the beginning was the Bible, and the Bible was with God, and the Bible was God. Does that make sense? No. Right? So, the word refers to, what's the answer in crossover? It's always Jesus. So now, Shiloh, read that first verse again, and replace the word word with Jesus.
In the beginning was
Sure, that's fine.
In the beginning was the Jesus, and the Jesus was with God, and the Jesus was God.
Okay, and then when you look at it, the next three verses, suddenly it's given him a pronoun. He was in the beginning with God. All things were created through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and life was the light of men. So what we recognize is that John begins differently than the other three Gospels, mostly because at the time that John was written after the other three Gospels. It was the latest. And people had started to trust knowledge, words, instead of truth. And they just thought that knowledge and information would strengthen us and preserve us and save us. All right? So, what does it say about who Jesus is? Jot down some things there under that. What does it say about who Jesus is? 1 through 4. Give me some things. What does it say about Jesus in 1 through 4? Shiloh?
He is God.
He is God. Good. Write that down. He is God. What else does it say about him? He is God. What else? Ada?
He is a light.
He is
A light.
a light. He is a light. Correct. Good. How about when it says, in the beginning was Jesus? What word would we maybe use for Jesus, Shiloh?
He's going to be the Virgin.
So yeah. So what do we give him that? What is he?
I mean,
That's what I'm looking for. You said eternity. I was looking for eternal. You're right. So he is eternal. Jot that down as well. Okay? Now, somebody read John 1:14 for me, please. 1:14. Micah, would you please?
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
All right. So it says the Word, and what is the Word? Jesus. So this basically says, so Jesus became flesh, dwelt among us, and having seen his glory as of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. So this is a really important concept for us And in confirmation, it's one of those key teachings that we have. So when it says Jesus became flesh, what does that mean about Jesus? What happened to him?
He came to on earth in human form.
There you go. That's what I'm looking for. He became human, right? Now, so how human was Jesus? Was he half human? Was he a third human? Was he completely human? He's completely human, okay? So we would say 100%, okay? But then it goes on and says, and we have seen his glory. Any of you got glory? Can you show glory? Nope, right? We can't. You know why? We're not God, right? God is glory. God has glory, okay? So it says we have seen his glory, glory of the only Son of the Father, Father being the God in heaven, full of grace and truth. So it shows that Jesus is God. Is he half God? Is he a third God? Is he all God? Okay, now see, if he's all God, 100% man and 100% God is 200%. That doesn't make any sense. But that's the way it is, right? Jesus is, we say in the church, true God and true man. Or I'll say completely God and completely man. So give you an example. That Bible that you have open in front of you, is it different than any other book ever created? The answer is yes. The reason it is because it is the very voice of God at the same time that it's ink and paper in front of you. So it has a physical attribute to it, and it also has a divine attribute. It is earthly and at the same time divine, godly, right? So your Bible is actually in some ways similar to Jesus. Jesus was physical, human, and at the same time divine, God. Sometime soon, you guys are going to participate in communion, right? Micah takes communion. Connor takes communion. And when you take communion, you take that wafer. Is it bread? Yes, it is. Is it flesh of God? Yes, it is. It's both. Now, it's not half and half. Just like Jesus wasn't half man, half God, he was completely man, completely God. So that wafer or that wine is wine, and it is Christ's blood. It is flesh, at the same time, it is bread, right? And that's so when we participate with that, we're trusting that that same truth about who Jesus is something that we experience in the supper as well. So, underneath that little sentence there, 114, what other information is given about who Jesus is? He is true God and true man. And if you need to define what that is, just say 100% man, 100% God. Questions on that? We're going to spend more time on Jesus' identity. That's not the whole of it, but that's at least the beginning, the gist of where we are. Down at the bottom, go to Matthew chapter 1. You're in John 1, go to Matthew 1, go backwards, 3 Gospels. And Matthew's Gospel begins with what we call a genealogy. Genealogy is your ancestry. Today, you can do that with Ancestry.com, right? There's a program you can get on the internet, I think, and you give them your name and, all the ancestors you know of. Here's the name of my parents, my grandparents, my uncles and aunts. And then they scan their database, which is always growing because people are doing this, and then find out who's related to who. We call it a family tree. Right? If you guys ever heard of a family tree, like, here's my mom and dad, here's their moms and dads, here's, so forth. And obviously, everything comes down to where you are currently at this point, but you can track back, several generations. Sometimes people go back dozens of generations and find things out. I was talking with somebody the other day who was related to Daniel Boone. I thought that was kind of cool, right? They were actually related to Daniel Boone. And obviously, he was around a long time ago, so several generations. I just thought it was kind of cool that she had figured that out. So Matthew 1 through 16, let me read through this, and you guys tell me if any of these names pop in your head as far as are these important names that maybe we've heard about. So, begin with verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, all right, the son of Abraham, There's some good ones. All right, so it goes through and says Abraham was the father of Isaac. Should recognize that. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. How many brothers?
11 brothers.
11, you're right. 12 brothers totally, but how many brothers of Judah? It would have been 11 counting him, 12 counting him. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. You recognize Rahab? Right? Remember that Rahab was the one gal who protected them when they came into the city of Jericho and protected them, and she was a prostitute. And people would have said, oh, she's no good at all. And yet she is in the genealogy of Jesus. Right? We said that back when we first talked about that. And Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. Right? You might recognize Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. Jesse, the father of David, the king. Right? So here we go. Now we pick up from David. David was the father of Solomon. Okay? Solomon by wife of Uriah. Who was Uriah's wife? Bathsheba, correct. Solomon, the father of Rehoboam, first king, right, of the northern kingdom. Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. Abijah, the father of Asaph. Asaph, the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, the father of Joram. Joram, the father of Uzziah. Uzziah, the father of Jotham. Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. You should recognize Hezekiah. Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. From your quiz, what do you know about Manasseh? He was the worst king ever. Right? When I asked that question, which one is the worst king? Manasseh was the answer. All right? Manasseh, the father of Amos. Another king. Amos, the father of Josiah, last good king. Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. That's when they got hauled off into exile. Verse 12, after the deportation to Babylon, you got Jeconiah, the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel, the father of Abiud. Abiud, the father of Eliakim. Eliakim, the father of Azor. Azor, the father of Zadok. Zadok, the father of Achim. Achim, the father of Eliud. Eliud, the father of Eleazar. Eleazar, the father of Mathan. Mathan, the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Joseph. Joseph, the husband to Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. All right? So there's his family line, and we can go all the way back to Abraham. And when you remember, God made a promise to Abraham, I will make from you a great nation, and all nations will be blessed through you. Now, he was not saying that Abraham himself was going to be a blessing to everyone. In fact, if you remember, Abraham only had the one son, Isaac, right? And he almost killed Isaac by command of God to prove his faithfulness. Not that he knew that, but we do as we read the story. And yet somewhere down the line of Abraham's lineage comes the Messiah. So through Abraham does come the one that will bless the entire world, at least those that trust in him. Okay? So there's the truth. There's the example. So what do you notice out of that? Jot this down. I think these are worth noting. His descendants, people like David and Abraham, I'd note those and so forth. You know what else I notice when I read through that genealogy is that his genealogy is filled with sinners. All right? Jot that down. His genealogy is filled with sinners. Give me some examples that I read. Sinners. I mean, all of them are sinners, but known sinners. Leah?
Yes.
Manasseh, the worst king ever. Who else? Who was the prostitute? Rahab, right? And so you could go through this and find these individuals and say, yet Jesus still used them to bring about the promised Messiah. I think, guys, if there's anything really, really, really great about that, is that we don't become believers in Jesus because we are worthy or because we are good or perfect. God uses us no matter where we are, but he also molds us and transforms us prayerfully. Bottom of the page there in that little blue box, it says Rome was the fourth kingdom that the prophet Daniel talked about. And so let me just go back to that, right? Here it is, okay? Rome was the fourth kingdom, okay? So the fourth kingdom right here. So this is what Daniel was talking about when he defined or interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar didn't know anything besides this. He's like, I had this dream, and this is what the statue looks like, and it's this. And the fact that this happens to it, he says, I'm really concerned, right? Because it seems bad, so what does it mean? And so Daniel says, well, Nebuchadnezzar, good news. You're the head. Golden head. And he goes, okay, that's okay. And he said, and then there's other kingdoms that are going to come after you. That would have been a little unsettling for a king. Right, to say, so I'm not going to rule forever. It's not going to be my people forever. It's going to change, right? And so what we see is the fifth kingdom that Daniel had foretold, the eternal kingdom, that is this guy, right? Well, this guy. It is this occurrence. The kingdom of God is going to overshadow everything. Where you think that the Romans are the most powerful, or the Greeks are the most powerful, or the Babylonians are the most powerful, God rules over all. God is supreme. All right? All right, next page. Birth of Jesus. Open your Bibles to Luke, please. Luke, chapter 2. Luke, chapter 2. Starting with very first 1. Matthew mentions Jesus' birth, but only Luke records the events of Jesus' birth. So Matthew mentions it. Jesus was born. But Luke goes into a great deal of detail. Again, probably because, what was he again, Luke? He was a doctor, a physician. So details were important, right? So he doesn't say, that guy has a smaller hand. He says, oh, it's palsy. I diagnosed it like a doctor could, all right? So listen to somebody read Luke 2, 1 through 7. Somebody have it? Luke 2. Ada?
In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. He registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them.
Now I'm guessing that most all of you have heard that particular reading there, because it is what we call the Christmas story. It gives the most detail about this. Now, while Quirinius was governor and Caesar, and so here you have, under the Caesars, this is the Roman Empire at this point, right? So when we think the Babylonians are gone, right? The Persians and the Medes, they're gone. The Greeks, mostly gone. And now the Romans are in charge. So this is where Jesus comes in. So when Caesar Augustus, and there's lots of Caesars, and so forth, says that we're going to have, a census, which means we want to count everybody. We have census in our country, I think, every decade. I think it's every 10 years we have a census in the U.S. And we go around, we count, we figure out what's their background, where are they from, and so just to kind of get an idea of who's here, and what we need to be aware of, and how do we support our schools, and what kind of other programs do we need based on people. And so everybody, to make this easy, at least from Roman standpoint, you got to go back to your hometown, where you're from. How many of you, by show of hands, were born here in Jeff City? Right? So just a couple of you, okay? So some of you have a different hometown. If you were around at this time, you'd be going somewhere other than Jeff City. You'd go back to your hometown and be counted. Now, it's interesting as we go through this. It says Joseph and Mary arrived for the Roman census in Bethlehem, the hometown of their ancestor, King David, right? It's often referred to as the city of David. Bethlehem was not a big town, right? It was a relatively small town, several hundred people, just in time for Mary to give birth. Let's see. Ladies, would you look up Micah 5:2? You might have to look in the table of contents. And Micah and Connor, look up 2 Samuel 7. Both of these are in the Old Testament. Ladies, Micah 5:2, and gentlemen, 2 Samuel 7.
2 Samuel.
Yes, 2 Samuel, not first. Holler out a page number for Micah, guys, once you get it. Micah 5.
It starts on 5:23 and
5:23.
it ends on 5:1.
Micah 5.
Yeah, it's on 9:26. In the
Give it to me again.
926.
9:26. I misheard you. 9:26, somewhere in there. All right.
Okay, and with the small print Bibles, it's 778.
There you go. Okay. All right, who's got it? Micah 5:2. Somebody, Shiloh? Yes, please. 5:2.
But you, O Bethlehem, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me. One who is to be ruler in Israel, who is coming forth is from ancient days.
All right, so it's announced that the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem. Jot that down. It asks underneath there, how are these Old Testament verses fulfilled? The Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem. All right, so that's one of the prophecies. Ladies, jot that down for me. The Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem. How are these Old Testament verses fulfilled? All right, and gentlemen, Connor or Micah, 2 Samuel 7.
How much do you want to read?
12 and 13.
When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise you up, your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish it. You shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever.
All right, so even though it doesn't mention his name, if we read through the rest of that chapter, you would find out that the writer is talking about David, right? So two things we learn from that, and jot it down. One is the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem. Second, he's going to come from the line of David, right? So he's going to be born in Bethlehem, coming from the line of David. Now it says underneath there, keep going here. It says Bethlehem was full of travelers. There was no room in the inn, so Mary gave birth to Jesus in a place where animals were kept and laid him in a manger. I'm not going to read that. That should be very, very familiar to all of you and what it is. Here's something I want you guys to know. I'm not trying to twist you up a little bit on this, but a lot of times we have what we call nativity scenes at Christmas time, and you have this animals laying around and Mary and Joseph, and it's kind of like a barn and a little bed and so forth. That's probably not accurate, right? And if your folks have kind of said, yeah, it could have been a cave, it's a good chance it was a cave. It even could have been in a house that just happens to, in Old Testament times, in the cold, they would actually bring the animals into the house. And they would sometimes put them on a lower level, and they would sleep up on a higher level. And then there were places to feed the animals. Because here's the case. For those of you guys that didn't raise your hand, not being born in Jeff City, if you guys went back to your hometown, is there family there? If you went back to your hometown, no relations at all anymore? One? Okay. So here's my point. The reason I ask that, and for those of you who are born in Jeff City, it's probably true too. If you go back to your hometown, there's a good chance that you have family that still lives there. I came from Michigan, right? A little town called Midland, Michigan. And I have two brothers and their families still live there. Okay? So if I went back to my hometown, there'd be a good chance that I would stay with family. Right? They'd put me up in a guest room and so forth. Especially if my wife was pregnant. Now, before we take this too much further, what did many people believe was true about Mary and Joseph? They did that before they were married, right? She was pregnant and they weren't married yet. And so that would have been really kind of an embarrassing stigma. And it might have been, you're not staying with us, right? It'll hurt our reputation to have you stay with us. Right, Shiloh?
I was born in Jeff City, but I lived in Newport.
Okay, all right. And that's not too far apart. But yeah, different hometowns and things. So the manger, we're not sure. The fact that he was laying in a manger, that is factually true. Where the manger was located, was it in a cave? Was it in a little building behind the inn? We make up a lot of stuff about this, right? Often in little Christmas pageants, we also have an innkeeper that says, sorry, we have no room for you. And there's no mention of an innkeeper. It just says there was no room in this guest room. Right? It might have been there's no room. It might have been they were refused. Whatever the case may be. Connor?
Didn't it, like, also nativity sets, like, the three wise men are also there in some of them, and they weren't there until, like, later.
They actually show up 2 years later. And we'll talk about that briefly. But, yeah, you're right. We sometimes put them right there in the... And there's animals all over the place. And we really have no mention of animals other than a manger is something that we feed animals out of. But it also probably makes a pretty effective cradle, right, for a baby. It could have been, just because I have a dog kennel in my garage doesn't mean I have a dog. Just means I happen to have a dog kennel in my garage, right? So anyhow, we got to take the information for what we actually have, and sometimes we grow a whole lot of things around it, okay? By the way, are there three wise men?
There are always wise men, and there are three gifts mentioned.
There you go. We know there's plural because it says wise men, not wise man, and there's three gifts. There could have been a dozen wise men. I think that's probably a little high, right? But we always have three wise men. We've actually even given them names, right? We've in some cultures, and they're not in the Bible, right? Other than the wise men. So, and again, I'm not trying to twist you up on the story. There very well could have been three. But we kind of go, oh, there were three. And you're like, nah, if you look at the facts are there were wise men. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many. How many gifts? Oh, there were three, right? Three kinds of gifts, right? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. That we know. But again, and this is a lesson to us all, read the Bible and take it for what it says. Don't breathe anything into it. Don't take anything away from it, okay? And then it goes on. Then it talks about who are the first ones to hear about the birth of the promised Messiah. That was shepherds. Okay? Shepherds were kind of lowly workers. These were not really important people culturally. They weren't Pharisees. They weren't priests. They weren't politicians. They weren't popular. They were just everyday workers that kind of lived out in the woods. They weren't normal, run-of-the-mill, walk-around-the-neighborhood kind of people. They probably smelled bad because they lived out in the woods because they had to keep the sheep out where the grasses were. They wouldn't have the sheep in town, right? They'd have them out. They'd have to live out there. They have to keep them safe out there, so they'd sleep by them, all those things. So it's interesting that Jesus, God, chooses to come to them first. A whole bunch of angels, right? And say, we got great news for you. The Messiah is finally here. We're telling you first. So talk about the shepherd's response and Mary's response. We'll skip that for now. So then we have, one of you mentioned the presentation of Jesus. Ada, I think you mentioned this. When Jesus was 40 days old, and that was the process. And I'm not trying to embarrass you guys at your age, but after a woman gives birth, it's really hard on her body. Right? She doesn't just bounce right back up and kind of go, all right, let's get back to it, right? It's hard, and it goes through a lot physically. So the dedication to take the baby to the temple happened about a month afterwards. Heal, recuperate, right? Let the baby kind of gain some strength and so forth, and then you can travel, okay, to go to the temple and so forth. So that's why it's 40 days. But 40 days is kind of significant in a lot of the biblical history. Right? 40 days, 40 years, things like that are kind of important numbers. Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to be presented to the Lord in accordance to Moses' law. Moses, they call it Mosaic. The old man named Simeon, who was waiting for the Messiah, God told him you wouldn't die until you saw the Messiah. And so the Holy Spirit received him that he would see Christ before he died. And Simeon took Jesus in his arms and he celebrates. That's what we see in Luke 2. Jesus was the Messiah who would bring salvation to the world. He was the one whom Isaiah prophesied about, a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. All right, look left. The visit of the wise men. Connor just mentioned this. Only Matthew records the visit of the wise men. Interesting. Luke has lots of details about his birth, but doesn't mention the wise men. Matthew's really the only one. Again, this is one of the reasons I believe it's really good that we have 4 Gospels, right? Different avenues. The wise men were magi. They were not kings. So when you hear somebody says, we 3 kings, as far as the old Christmas song goes, they weren't kings. They were wise men, which means they were college professors, if you want to think of them that way. They were really good teachers, knew a lot, read a lot, and that's one of the reasons they come traveling, wondering. They're searching knowledge, trying to figure out what this star means that's in the sky. They were Gentiles, not Jews, and a Gentile is just a non-Jew. Gentile isn't from Gentilia, right? There's not a country, right? Not that Jews are from any place else, they're from the Promised Land. But they came from the east, which is most likely, look at those names there, Babylon, Persia, right? And so again, you can see this. Babylon would be up there. Persia would be here. So those kingdoms are still regions, still places where folks come from, or Arabia. The wise men knew that a king of the Jews had been born, but the text doesn't say that they knew that he was the Son of God. So they're like, somebody important has been born. We've read it in the scriptures. They had access to Old Testament scrolls, so they were looking at prophecies. But they didn't necessarily believe that he was the Son of God. There's no indication that they came to worship him. And I'll say that this way, guys, based on the gifts that they brought. The gifts that they brought were rare gifts, not necessarily recognizing that this was God. That would have been different. The Hebrews brought sacrifices to the temple, to God, and things like that. So that's not what these are. The star led them to Judea, then right to where Jesus' family was living at the time in Bethlehem. So this is not when he's in the manger. The wise men don't, if you think about it, the star appears over Bethlehem and Jesus is born. They come from the east. If they showed up that night, they made really good time. Right? They traveled several hundred miles in one night. Not possible. What they did is they traveled a little bit all the time. Once they saw it, they researched what it meant. They're not sure what it means, but they decide to start following it, thinking that they're going to learn something when they get there. They stop and talk to King Herod. We saw a star. The scroll tells us it's the king of the Jews. Herod goes, I don't want any other kings around. I'm kind of jealous. But he lies to him and says, tell me when you find him so I can come worship him too. He's like, no, because I'm going to kill him. Right? Because Herod didn't want any competition. And if you guys know the story, it doesn't talk about it here tonight, is that then Herod had every male child in Bethlehem under the age of 2 killed. That's how we know 2 years had passed since Jesus had been born. Okay? Herod and the Jewish leaders had no idea that the Messiah had been born. They could care less about the Hebrew scriptures. Wise men presented Jesus with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They were the first of many Gentiles to worship Jesus. So how does this event show God's love for all people of the world? What do you guys think? Right? The shepherds, right? The wise men, and things like that. What does that mean that you think about God's love for all the people in the world? How does that show it, Shiloh?
Sent the Savior to save us.
Sent the Savior to save not only us, and what I mean by us is all of us. Right? God didn't just come to save the Jews. So jot that down. That God came to save all people. All people. Okay? All right, real quick, and then I'm going to wrap it up. The Gospels don't tell us much about the childhood of Jesus. As I mentioned right at the very beginning, we get his birth. We get his dedication at 40 days old. And then he goes to the temple at 12. The next time we see him, he's getting baptized by John at the age of 30. So 18 years have passed where we don't have any story, right? When Jesus was 12, he went with Mary and Joseph, many families of Jerusalem, to celebrate the Passover. On the way home, Mary and Joseph discovered Jesus wasn't among the families. They rushed back to Jerusalem, searching high and low until the third day. They had lost him for 3 days. You guys may have gotten lost at a time, in a mall or a store or out in the woods. He was lost for 3 days. They rushed back to Jerusalem, and he was sitting with a group of teachers, listening and asking questions. They were amazed at his understanding. When Mary asked him why he had treated them this way, he answered, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" And we're not going to answer that tonight because I'm going to wrap it up. But the point is that he said, listen, the reason I came was not just to be a young boy in Bethlehem. The reason I came was to die for all people's sins. And that's a pretty big deal and pretty serious for them. All right, so that's it. For those of you watching at home, your assignment is going to be page 84. And to finish that, so page 84, under the connections, Jesus is the promise fulfilled. So folks watching at home, that's your assignment, those 3 prophecies and what they mean. And that's what we'll do for you guys. So let's close.